Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, perhaps better known as VUCA, an acronym that was first introduced in the early 90s by the American military to describe extreme conditions after the Cold War. It took off in a business context after the 2008 global financial crisis. We wrote an article about it then, and over 15 years on, it still makes our annual top blog list. So what is it that resonates? I'm joined today by Kay Woodburn, the founder of Gritty People, and someone who works with corporates and people from all over the world to make changes that will help them navigate their VUCA landscapes. So, Kay, welcome to In Good Company. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a delight to have you here, and thank you ever so much for giving us some of your time today to talk about all things VUCA. We always start with the same question for our podcast, which is to give our audience a chance to get to know our guests a little bit better, which is to tell us about yourself in 60 seconds.
Okay, that's challenge number one. In 60 seconds. So my background is in corporate business. So I worked corporately for about 12, 13 years. That's my background. Always worked in learning and development of some form. So whether that's been in transformation, behavioral change, leadership development. But the core of that was really developing people in large organizations and running teams that did that. And then 10 years ago, as you said in that introduction, I set up Gritty People. And I feel really fortunate I am one of them really annoying, lucky people who gets to do what they're passionate about every day. And so now, like you said, I travel the world. I'm really passionate about mindset. I think we have this amazing tool inside our brain, inside our head called a brain, and we don't always have the instruction manual to hand. So what I love doing is going around meeting people from all walks of life, whether that's in business, leaders, sport, and helping them understand how they can use it in a different way to navigate challenging situations. I'm also a mother to two young adults, Jade and Cameron. They are 18 and 23. So I have a bit of experience with that whole navigating a landscape as well, bringing up teenagers. Who I also feel very fortunate to say they're my best friends. Like I'm very lucky to have them in my life as well. And my husband, Stuart, so he's been around this whole journey as well since I was very young. So yeah, so I'm a bit of everything, like we all are.
Yeah, absolutely, and yeah, clearly that passion resonates straight away in that first introduction. So yeah, I'm sure we'll get to some interesting stuff today. So let's get straight into it, I guess. So we said the words in the introduction there as we've gone through it, but let's get your take on the VUCA framework and how. And from your perspective, it's been traditionally used to understand business and leadership challenges.
Yeah, so I mean, you said in your introduction, it's interesting to me, that introduction around where it came from originally, the US military, and how it was then adopted in business in around 2008. And I think for me, what came then was the term VUCA. Not what changes or what it means, because that's been around for a very long time. So VUCA for me, as many things, it's an experience. It's something that we experience. And that very term VUCA enables us to put some labeling and some framework around it to make something that in itself is really complex, have some sort of meaning and purpose, and gives people a framework, an understanding of how they might be able to use a framework to navigate change. And I think that's probably the first thing around it. While the term, in my personal view, the term was developed then, humans have been around for a long time before then. So it's a framework that makes it more understandable and helpful. And there's something quite powerful in that, because by having the framework, it gives an acknowledgement that people are not alone, businesses are not alone. This difficult landscape that we sometimes have to navigate is there for all of us. So let's get into it. So the V stands for volatile. And volatile really is when a leader or business is going through something it might feel like plain sailing, everything's going great, and all of a sudden something unexpected emerges. So it's not necessarily something we could have even planned for. It's just a bit of a curveball. Something appears, something changes, and that can feel quite uncomfortable. It's a volatile experience. Uncertainty is what the U stands for within the framework, and that is more about the inability to forecast. And I think a very real example of this, actually, dare I say the P word, the pandemic, that, the uncertainty within that in businesses and for leaders, I think we're seeing a lot of now, because people were doing long-term plans, whether that was 12, 3 to 5 years, pretty standard for a business to plan that far out and forecast. Certainly what I experienced in my own business, and also with those that I work with, is that unpredictability and that the ability to forecast were increased. So that changed to like 3 to 6 months planning, because people were way too uncomfortable with the uncertainty of forecasting further out. And I'm still seeing that now, where we are now, that actually we're doing a lot of development programs and leadership development, which is helping people move back to that longer term planning, because we have got a little more uncertainty in certain areas now. So that's, I guess, an example of where that might emerge. Complexity is what the C stands for. And that is really about this multi-layered, all the multi-layered systems that we have in organizations. And also that's fueled in many ways by the technology that we now have access to, which is incredible and fantastic. But it also creates a level of complexity, because we have different systems coming at us from everywhere. We've got AI, we've got different systems that are all needing to interconnect with each other at a process level. And then you've got the human element of that as well. So lots of different layers and different functions that need to come together, which can create a great deal of complexity. And then finally, the A stands for ambiguous. And that's really just when things don't have clarity. And we see that a lot in business and, from a leadership point of view. And for me, that's where the human element really starts to surface. And the reason for that is because we're all different. And there's a uniqueness in human beings. We all have different preferences. We all have different ways of gathering information and data. Some people have an outlook which is very fact-based, for example, and they need lots of information, whereas some people are very focused on the future and themes and patterns. And you put these two things together, and it can be quite ambiguous in terms of the overall goal, for example, or how people communicate with each other. So there's that's VUCA in a nutshell. That's what it stands for: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it's present everywhere, all the time.
And as you were talking, then I was reflecting back on a previous episode where we were talking about the polycrisis. Now, it wasn't even a term I was aware of, but I'm sure people in different positions will be very aware of the polycrisis, and it being this state that we're in, that we're always got something to face. And so a VUCA environment doesn't necessarily just have to pinpoint to one thing that's, like, for example, the pandemic, or it's so many, it just relates to pretty much everyday life. And in some cases more extreme than others, I would think. So that was really interesting. So when you're working with corporates then, or groups or individuals, and introducing that concept, how do you find that there are people that aren't familiar with the term? How does it resonate with them?
Yeah, I mean, so the first question of people not familiar with it, and it always surprises me, and then I have to remind myself of two things. Not everybody lives in the world that I live in terms of talking about this often and in the world of development. And secondly, we've got a lot of new leaders and new people joining the workforce. So it's always new. I think year on year, like I say, I've been doing what I do now for more than 10 years, but since I left my corporate world roles, and it's always new and refreshing. And yes, so you always get these nods of, okay, this is interesting. And secondly, the point around resonation, yes, it's often met with majority, because obviously sometimes some people have heard of it before and they're nodding saying, yeah, I've heard this before. It's a good reminder. But mostly you just get these almost light sniggers and little smiles and gentle nods.
Yeah.
And when you get into that with groups, it's interesting. And, the individuals within the groups, it's normally,
Just
that's what I'm going
yeah,
through.
yeah, yeah,
Like a
yeah,
relief. Yeah. So yeah, it
yeah.
does resonate. And I think it helps place some meaning on what people are experiencing, and it feels good that actually they're not alone. And that's generally what kind of response it gets when we start to talk about VUCA.
And I suppose that's really interesting, because the other thing, of course, is that the VUCA. I mean, as we sort of pointed out, it's been that framework, as you put it. It's been around since the late 80s, early 90s. Certainly from a business context, it was slightly later, but it's obviously stood the test of time. So, what do you think that it is about VUCA that's made it so timeless?
I think it goes back to this thing that change isn't new. I think
Mm,
we are always evolving as human beings, as leaders, as businesses. If there's one thing that is certain within uncertainty, it is change. Like,
yeah.
change is inevitable; it's always happening. So, and coming to your point earlier, it's such a valid one. It's not just these black swan events that require this kind of framework and this mindset towards change. It's there's a new person in my team, and it's completely changed the roles and responsibilities. And I'm not quite sure what this means for me now. It feels quite uncertain. Or we've brought in a new system, and now the system has changed how we do something somewhere else.
Yeah.
I've had a conversation with somebody and it's changed my mindset and my belief system. So
Mm,
this belief I had has now changed. And that's it feels a bit like a three-legged stool having one of the legs being taken out of it,
yeah.
because my belief system's been changed through this journey that I've just gone on or I'm on. So I think to your point earlier as well, we have to recognize it's not just big events.
Yeah.
The small events can be big in here,
Yeah.
for the individual, and so I think that's why it has and always will stand the test of time. I think as an acronym, we might say it's been a long time, around a long time. It's time for something new. I think other things will coexist with it.
Hmm.
Personally, don't think it's going anywhere. I think it'll. The reason it's been around for a long time is because it really explains well how we are as human beings and what we need at a basic human fundamental
Yeah.
level, from each other to be able to um, steady waters that are maybe not feeling so calm.
Yeah, and it's a really good way of thinking about it. I mean, it clearly shows you've talked about this in a lot of different scenarios where the scalability of the way that you think about VUCA. Because I
Yeah.
suppose for if you're not that familiar with it, or if you don't regularly kind of draw on it, then if you do any sort of reading about VUCA, the top level is all about the big events that are happening in the world and how we, as a
Yeah.
collective, but it absolutely can be scaled down to there's a new system that we have to learn, and that's going to change
Yeah.
behaviors, and that's going to ruffle some feathers, and all of that stuff which you don't necessarily consider. So to hear it from that point of view is really interesting, and I'm sure like you say, that light bulb moment for a lot of people, that they've
Yeah.
suddenly got something that they can draw on to help navigate through those things.
Yeah, and if I can build on that briefly, just on the back of what you've just said there about, not everybody will have heard the term. And,
Mm,
I'm talking about this at a basic human level. An example of that might be, let's not, because we talked about uncertainty before, let's go to complexity.
mhm,
When something's complex, people start to lose meaning. Like, I don't know why I'm doing this. So they just need some clarity. And you'll
mm,
hear people, like if it was a child, you would hear a child say, but why? But why? But why? And sometimes, like as parents or
yeah,
adults around children, we'll explain, and eventually we might go, because I'm your mother and I told you so, or
yeah,
because I'm your father and just do it. We call rank a little bit, and that can happen in the workforce as well. That can happen in leadership roles and teams because there's pressure. But
mm,
actually, as an adult, what we tend to say is, "What's the rationale behind that?" Or could you give me the strategy? We use different language. But essentially, the language and the question is coming from the same part of the brain. The limbic system, which actually can be really well engaged with you. It can, it's responsible for emotional responses. It needs to understand why we're doing things so that it can be motivated to get on board. It's actually got a deep desire to be on the bus, to be with us. So I think from a leadership point of view, when we hear our team saying, but why, which will sound like, what's the rationale and can you explain the strategy? What they're really saying is, can you give me some clarity? Because I'm feeling really wobbly here. I can't get on board because this bit of my brain isn't with me. And so there's a lot of good research grounded in psychology and biology that supports why this isn't going anywhere, because our brain's still our brain. So I think it just, again, reinforces why this framework for me will stand the test of time, and it'll be there. We'll be talking about it in another 20 years' time.
I suppose we've kind of, VUCA's a great acronym for describing that problem. What would you say then? So like in terms of describing it as or applying it to a problem, what would you say are some of the solutions that can be used? What skills and competencies are essential for leaders to navigate a VUCA environment?
It's a good question, because it starts to bring it down, because like the framework is just a framework, but it's the behaviors within it. I think for me, great leadership starts with great leadership of self. And so again, there's two answers to that question, Dan, for me. One of them is, as a leader, you are, I am, we are such an important power source for other people. I think it's underestimated how much influence we have. So if somebody as the leader has got, whether you've got one person in your team or 100 people, as the leader of that organization, you hold great influence, whether you want it or not. So shining a light back on yourself to begin with, and developing these skills is so important for behavioral change. And it's not just about sending your team on a program or it's also being involved in that process for me. And so I think everyone doing it obviously increases everything by 1%, makes it even better. And I think some of the skills, one, emotional intelligence, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes with that, but increasing your own self-awareness about how you respond in these environments when they're complex and uncertain, for example, as a leader. And you'll probably, most of us will notice that in different elements of change, we have different responses to stress and pressure and uncertainty. And so if you develop emotional intelligence within yourself, you can develop that self-awareness, and then you can develop the skills around self-management to be able to manage that in a different way. So you do become a really good, powerful resource for other people. And I think what sits within that isn't that complicated. It's things that we probably hear all the time, but a bit like breathing. It's like we breathe every day, but do we breathe well? Do you breathe as well today as you did when you was a baby?
That's a very good question. I wouldn't even know.
If you look at a baby breathing, a baby breathes like a big balloon. They fully use the diaphragm and they breathe the full capacity. And what changes that over time is stress, like cortisol being released into the body, as learning tension and all these things. And so for me, it's a nice comparison to, just because you listen, do you listen well? Sure, you'll ask questions, but do you ask questions well? And when you ask that question, do you really listen to what the response is? So for me, some of the basic stuff are the meta skills for leaders to develop to help navigate change, because it allows us to really see what's going on in front of us and think, right, what do I need to do? What the answer is yes. What's the question? I can see something's not right here. What do they need? They need more clarity. They need to understand more, but we only get that if we start with those skills. So I think, emotional intelligence, great questioning, good listening, these developable skills are things to focus on. Really good decision making. I had a client ask me a question a few months ago, and then asked me the same question a month later, and they're in a bit of a dilemma. And my response was quite simply, no decision is a decision. because he's not making a decision about something really important. And so that's something we're working on at the moment, because in this environment, decision making at a fast pace and being confident with that, it's actually really important. So decision making, and there's probably a million others, but the last one I'd say is just an open-mindedness and flexibility, because when you're in these changing environments, you can't be too rigid. And some people's personality preference will be to do things in a certain linear order. And that's not always going to be helpful when you're in this kind of environment. I often say to people, look, let's start with 20% either way. How does that feel? Let's just let go of the reins just a little bit and see what that's like.
And some of that comes with experience, I guess, doesn't it? It's like, sometimes you'll have to experience what it's like when it goes wrong. I mean, I suppose that's why a lot of the stuff that we do on our programs is there to simulate that, but in a safe way, right? So that they can kind of make mistakes and reflect on that and then bring it back. And so that's been and I really like what you were saying there about like emotional intelligence and that kind of those qualities that make up a sort of a human-centric leader, taking a human-centric approach to both yourself, which can then have a knock-on effect to wider teams and wider spheres of influence. I think that was a really nice reflection there as well. You mentioned other frameworks slightly earlier on, and I wanted to touch on that because I don't think that anybody who kind of knows about VUCA and quite a bit about VUCA have probably come across a newer acronym known as BANI, which stands for brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And some people can kind of describe VUCA as being the external conditions and BANI as the internal factors facing organizations. So I don't know if you've had a chance to kind of look up a bit more about BANI yet. We're going to be doing another podcast episode on BANI in the not too distant future. Do you see, I mean, you kind of touched on this already, but do you kind of see BANI as a potential replacement, or can you see them working together alongside each other, evolving and going alongside each other? Or do you think one will kind of dominate? What do you think?
I think, and it is just what I think, because like you said, the term's new, and I'm looking forward to listening to your podcast about BANI as well, because things are moving towards that kind of way of thinking. And I think, so for me, I do see them alongside each other. And the reason for that is that I receive BANI, as you've just mentioned, like an internal thing. So one of the things I always talk about, and whether it's coaching or workshops, is there's two elements to change, and the second one isn't even called change. So change for me sits within VUCA. It's external things that are going on in the environment that are imposed or initiated from somewhere or happening, and it creates this sense of volatility, etc. The things we were just talking about. What often gets missed, which is why I'm really happy to see that there's this focused on BANI, is the internal element, the things that go on for the human being personally and throughout a change process. And really that's transition. That's the internal thoughts, the feelings, the experiences that they're having. And organizations that put in place change programs and don't acknowledge that the individuals, the people are the ones that are going to make that change happen, are really missing a massive trick, because it's the individuals that are going to make the difference. So for me, BANI will coincide, but like as you just said, it's going to shine a spotlight somewhere else, which is what's happening internally. Yeah, inside the organization, but also, like, for example, the anxiety. Anxiety isn't something that is an organization or a business. It's the people within the business that are experiencing that, which is creating that environment. So so I think they will coexist. I think it's almost like flipping a coin and looking at the other side of it that maybe hasn't been examined quite as much as VUCA has.
Yeah, I mean, as we've said, it is newer, and the VUCA was new at one point, and it's it's quite possible that that they will stand the test of time, but we're not going to know until we find out. So yeah, I'm super excited because we're actually going to be interviewing the person who developed the BANI framework and the BANI acronym. So that'll be super interesting. But yeah, you mentioned about anxiety there as the A of BANI, and it is something that is rife, I think, at the moment. And I think possibly with across all generations of a workforce. So what strategies do you think can you advise? What strategies can be adopted to support individuals and help, I guess, prevent burnout associated with anxiety?
Yeah, and I'm going to come back as well. Sorry, just on that, like with the BANI thing,
Yeah.
I do personally feel that BANI is again a label that labels something that's been there for a long time. I think.
Yeah, I think that's
I
good.
think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's
So
a good call out. It's more, but as VUCA would have been.
Yeah, exactly.
And VUCA would have been. It's kind of gathering those thoughts, isn't it, to put it into, as you say, a framework that helps people understand things better.
Which is brilliant, and that's totally brilliant, because I think, and that is a precursor to this word anxiety, like, just acknowledging it, and it again gives people a sense of relief, like, oh, are other people feeling like this? Well, if somebody's created a framework for it, maybe they are, and so again, I think it's going to help in that way. I really do, and I hope so. The anxiety part of it, so anxiety. What is it? Anxiety is a label for a set of feelings and emotions that somebody's going through. Anxiety as a label for those feelings and emotions that people are experiencing is something that actually only exists in the past and the future. You can't do anxiety in the present moment. It doesn't exist. Anything where somebody feels that sense is because they're going into the past database of the brain and going, oh, that thing was really awful. Or looking to the future and going, oh, I hope it doesn't go wrong, or I'm worried. And so the basis of all anxiety is fear. That's where it comes from. It comes from our fear base. And fear is driven by two things. Our deepest fears come from two places: a fear of death and a fear of not being good enough. And underneath the fear of not being good enough is fear of rejection, a fear of non-acceptance, fear of judgment, etc., etc. So if you go underneath what anxiety is, you can keep digging, but ultimately it's fear and not feeling safe in one way or another. So when we think about how can an organization at a business level help individuals within the organization, well, my focus would be on psychological safety and helping creating a space in that organization where there is trust, where there is a sense where I'm able to bring my full self, my whole self to work, and that's okay and will be embraced and accepted. Where we're having powerful conversations in a way that I won't be humiliated or ridiculed for doing so, etc., etc. So I think, that particular word that you've asked me about specifically, how can leaders help create a world where people feel less anxious at work, well-being, making space for well-being activities and well-being time. And it's a big topic in itself, but creating a space of psychological safety. I mean, we could do another podcast on psychological safety, but I think that they're the things that help. But more than anything, providing space for that and time for people to do that, not just a constant task day, like actually not just saying, oh, we do well-being at work, but what does that look like and sound like, and are they supported to have that time to do that? So,
and sometimes it's just needing that time for, if people are noticing that there's an element of that of that lack of psychological safety, just allowing time to reflect on that there hasn't been that time allowed. It's a weird sort of cycle, isn't it? That you can kind of, especially unless of course somebody brings it to your attention. Like the communication is so key as well in that space. I would think that there's got to be somebody that makes that first step to make change happen, I guess, to allow for allow that time to develop these and put in place these protocols, I guess, to make change for the better, I guess. Yeah. All right. It's fascinating. As you say, we could end up with a whole extra episode just on that.
And by the way, if you wonder why I just went like that, my lights went off. So
I did. I thought he was using Jedi Force powers.
It was. It was a Jedi Force. You go like that, and the lights come back on. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Technology.
Well, yeah, isn't it just? And I've one question we did want to ask you, because we know that you've worked a lot with athletes in your time. From what you've experienced in that field, no, that was an unintended pun. what mindsets do they bring to life, and what do you think maybe could be some insights from you and from your work with them that leaders could benefit, and from an organizational point of view?
I do work with athletes, and I still work with them now. And there's so much transfer. I did a podcast recently, actually, about what can leaders learn from athletes. So there's a lot we can learn, and I guess one of them that I would pull out, and you've just said the word, which is why it's in my mind, I think, is reflection. So so when an athlete, there's a performance cycle for an athlete, and from a mindset point of view, you go through that performance cycle. But in terms of if you was to break up from a kind of how much time spending in different things point of view, athletes tend to spend about 20 to 25, like high performing athletes, 20 to 25% of the time reflecting, basically doing nothing. To the outside eye, it looks like doing nothing. So it's planning, or having massages, physio, spending time with me or whoever their mindset coach is, meditation, body scanning, which is all about managing the nervous system. And I often in workshops would say, okay, so how much time? So I'll share this and say, so how much time do you do that for as part of your high performance cycle? And of course, everyone just laughs, because most of the time leaders don't even spend 2% of the time reflecting. So I think that's a big learning. Like you need that part. Your brain needs that space to download everything that's coming during the day, to file it, to organize it, make sense from it. And that can be going for a walk, go for a swim, knitting, do whatever it is that makes you switch off, because our brains are in such a high state of action all the time. They never kind of drop down far enough to take in all this information that we've been given. And so I don't know if this ever happens to you, Dan, but when you kind of just nodding off at night and you're like getting comfy and you're just about to go into that lovely sleep, and then you go, I didn't send that email. Or did I reply that phone call? And I don't know if you've ever done that, but most people have had that experience or something similar at some point. And that's because all this stuff that's been vying for your attention couldn't get in during the day. So it knows, it's like, oh, the highway's clear, let's drive now. And so then people have interrupted sleep and things like that. So, so what could we learn from athletes, and also military as well, actually, not just athletes. Military tend to be well trained to have downtime and things like that, because they train a lot. So I often compare athletes to military as well, to soldiers. So there's a lot in there. But I guess essentially what I'm saying is reflect. Get comfortable reflecting. Learn to reflect, because it's not a natural thing for everybody. It's a great thing we could learn from athletes.
And do you think so in terms of time to reflect? Because I would imagine that from a work perspective, like when is the best time for people to reflect? I mean, I know that in a sense the answer can be any time, but like say for example, because I would imagine that, why do you think people don't reflect during a working day? For example, do you think it's because it doesn't look like work from an outsider's point of view? If you're sat going for, or you set off in the middle of the day going for a walk, why do you think there isn't enough reflection time? I guess is the main question there.
I don't think that. I don't think there isn't enough reflection time. I think people are not.
Maybe I should rephrase. You're right. But
No, it's a good
maybe,
question. No, it's a good
maybe,
question.
I suppose what I was getting at is, why do you think people don't make that time?
Yeah, but honestly, Dan, it's a good question because
Mm.
most people I meet would say it in that way because they will believe there's not enough reflection time. And I guess and the reason I kind of reframed it is because that's part of the answer, is reframe it, because there is enough reflection time, but perhaps not the same priority on the importance of that reflection time. And so when people ask me questions like that, the reason I kind of reframe it is because so if I said to them, if they said that to me and I said to them, okay, so your CEO has just put a meeting in your diary for 45 minutes, what would have to happen for you to not go to that meeting? And often people will say, oh, it'd have to be a family emergency or something, but it certainly wouldn't be anything else. It'd be something really quite important. And then I said, well, we'll put the meeting in your diary as the CEO, like meeting with CEO, because you're the CEO of you, and you are this power source for other people. You are the oxygen mask. Use whatever analogy you want to use that's going to really help people. So there's this, I think there's this lack of prioritization for self, and people sometimes find it selfish, like, oh no, that's me time. It's actually not me time. You are being employed within that organization as a leader, often being asked to use, create headspace, to strategize, etc. That's the time you're going to do it. You're going for a walk or going for a run or doing whatever else. So I think you're absolutely right. Like, there is 100% this mindset in a lot of organizations, and I don't want to blanket everyone, where people think there's not enough time in the day and that it's not important enough. And I guess very quickly, the second part of that is, when's the best time to do it? So there's some research done on this, and it's the 10 minutes before you finish the work day. So say you finish at 6. If you was to actually finish at 5:45 and spend that last 10 to 15 minutes writing a list of all the things you've got to do tomorrow, and then what you do, you write the list, and then next to the list, you put in brackets a number for the minutes, approximately how long you think it's going to take.
Yeah.
So what it does, it kind of closes the door on the day, because you have to quickly reflect on the day to get to what you want to do tomorrow. And the thing about the number is, it helps you, say you've got an 8-hour day the day after and your list is 10 hours. You've got to think about intentionally what you're doing tomorrow. So it's a nice reflection and intention setting. And the other piece of the research that was interesting is that people, because you do that before the end of the day, it goes back into the subconscious, and you're kind of working on it through the night without knowing you're working on it. So the second piece of the research is that the activities got done faster the following day than they anticipated, because part of the solution had already started to happen. If there is a really good time to do it, it's just before you actually finish the day. Helps people switch off and makes them more efficient the following day.
That is a really great top tip that people can take away, I think. And I'm going to ask you if you've got any more, because we've talked a lot about navigating VUCA challenges and how we can kind of equip ourselves with kind of tools to the toolbox, as to put it a better way of how we can navigate these challenges. So, and that was a really nice way of, because I think that can be applied to this question, I suppose, is that, having that reflection time is a really great way of navigating VUCA challenges, because you've got that time to reflect. So have you got any other sort of top tips that might be a sort of a quick win for people to, or is there anything that, when you introduce this framework, do any people go, how, what can I do tomorrow, for example, as a way? Is there anything else other than what we've just talked about?
I think, yes, I'd reiterate the ones I just said about just investing in self and the reflection. That really would be my top tip. I think top tip is, don't underestimate the value of investing some time in yourself. It's not selfish. It's part of the performance cycle. So include it. And ask more questions. it would probably be my second, the other one up there in that top. And that's because when we talk about complexity and uncertainty, etc., often we just don't know. But it's having the courage, if it feels like courage, to ask the questions. The more curious you can be and inquisitive of your own leaders and of your team and everyone around you, you take ownership of getting clarity and understanding and vision. So we talked a lot about leaders and looking to the leader to provide it, but every leader has a leader. So as a leader, ask questions, ask them confidently, have the courage to ask them, and you'll get more of that clarity and understanding than you can probably even begin to imagine. So be really curious and inquisitive and feel safe doing that, because most people will just respond and give you what the best they can give you. And if that's not the full answer, it's better than what you had before. And it will help you settle and manage your state throughout the change.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And that whole asking questions piece, I mean, I get to the point where I irritate people with the amount of questions I ask.
Me
sometimes,
too.
Which probably lends itself well to doing this job.
I am that person that will ask a question, but I know I'm doing it with positive intention. So,
yeah, exactly. Seeking to understand, right?
Totally. And I think
knowledge,
so if you're the same as that, you know exactly where I'm coming from. And sometimes, just to add to that is, because what you've just said, there's a really good point. You and I are really comfortable with that, and I've probably done that our whole life. If someone's listening and they're thinking, yeah, well, you're you and I'm me, start the question with that. Say, look, I might be about to ask you a few questions. You might not know the answer, but I'm doing it with positive intention. I'm trying to understand. And it just helps get into the question and makes that you feel better, but also the other person go, okay, you're not questioning or challenging, which is different. And can feel different. You being really, you're just saying, you're just trying to understand, and people will generally receive that really well as a question.
I think that's really good advice as well. Speaking of advice, we've reached our final question. And this is a bit more of a personal question, I suppose, and it's the one we always ask to close off our episodes, which is, if you were to start your career again, what would be the best piece of advice you would give yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it would be the same piece of advice, actually, that I give my clients, which is trust the process.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Do you trust the process now?
Or 100%. To the point that it makes other people nervous sometimes, because I'm like, no, I trust the process. Even at the messy bit in the middle, I'm so like, I trust the process. So I do mostly believe I do now. I'm sure there's times where I don't. And I think maybe if you go into new situations, I'm sure there's times when I don't, but mostly, yeah. And I think that would be my advice, trust the process.
And how many times have you said that to your kids?
Many times.
I can imagine. I bet
many times.
And maybe they'll get it tattooed on themselves at some point.
Don't talk about tattoos. My son's nearly 19 and he's already had a few of those. I don't think he's got much canvas left, to be honest.
Well, that can be the suggestion for the next one then.
I'll let him know when I get home, Dan. I'll ask him. I'll ask me what he thinks to that one. I'm sure he'll be down there this weekend.
Well, Kay, thank you very much. I've just looked at our time. We've gone. We've been chatting now for well over 40 minutes, which has been great, and it shows that it's been a nice, good conversation. Good conversation where we've got loads of stuff out of it. So I've certainly enjoyed it, and I hope those listening and watching have too. Which just leaves me to thank Kay again for joining me today. And if you'd like to find out either anything more about Impact, or you'd like to connect with either myself and Kay on LinkedIn, or perhaps you'd want to look back at our original VUCA blog, then you'll find all of those links, plus links to our previous episodes in the description of where you found today's episode. So thank you once again to Kay for joining me. Until the next time, take care.